Hey, good evening. We are doing night two here of AP Prep. As I said before, last night we are going to go over units 4 through 6, which basically takes us through the 1800s. The way I'm going to choose to go through this is to remind you the major accomplishments and events of presidential administrations, and then go back and talk about some of the themes that may come up on the AP exam. So just to quickly go through, when we're talking about the three different units, we're talking about the first one being the early republic. The early republic would basically be presidents 3 through 10. So Jefferson up to Tyler. Okay, Tyler is usually considered the end of the early republic, and that's not because he's ineffectual after taking over after William Henry Harrison. It's because Polk changes the mentality of what a president does. He even deviates from his mentor Jackson. So Polk becomes kind of the new version of the presidency, if you will. And that takes us into sectionalism because they kind of amp up the sectionalization of the country. Okay. During the early republic or the antebellum, as we talked about, there was really, the issue of sectionalization wasn't handled by the president, it was handled by Congress. Okay. The great triumvirate of Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, who, hey, Marion, I'm running an
Mhm.
AP section right now.
Mhm.
Okay. I'll be off at about 10. So if you want to log back in at 10, I can help you through.
Okay.
Okay. Thanks, buddy.
Mhm.
So up until Polk, Clay, Calhoun, and Webster, who you will notice are not on this list, they never became president. They were kind of the ones that were, shall we say, handling the sectionalization crisis as it was unfolding. It wasn't Jackson. If anything, Jackson was amplifying it. It wasn't Monroe. He was too busy kind of sitting back, letting everybody else do everything. So the presidents in the early republic or the antebellum really don't get involved in the growing sectional crisis of the United States. It's from Polk on, and I'll kind of explain why. And it's basically Polk up to Buchanan, because they are the ones that sectionalize the United States into two factions, and Lincoln comes in with the Civil War. Okay, so really Polk to Lincoln. And then the last unit that we're covering, Unit 6, is basically the late 1800s, Reconstruction, and the Gilded Age. So you're talking about Andrew Johnson, so 17, all the way up to and through McKinley, 25. And McKinley's kind of the barrier, if you will. So I choose to do the 1800s this way because sometimes it's the easiest way to understand um, kind of the differentiations of the government, the administrations, and the events that happen throughout the 1800s. So we start with Jefferson. Remember, Jefferson coming to power in 1801 after the election of 1800 is considered the Revolution of 1800. This was the first time that we had switched from the Federalist control of the government, which was Washington and Adams, to the Democratic Republican control under Jefferson. Now, Jefferson would have never considered what he would have never considered it to be a political party. That would have been an ugly term for him. Adams would have never considered himself really a Federalist in the traditional sense of a political party. These guys would have never been okay with that kind of connotation. It's not until Jackson forms the actual Democratic Party along with Van Buren in the 1820s that you really start to see political parties. If anything, this is mostly political ideologies. But needless to say, Jefferson is the first different political ideology to take over, which is going to beg some questions. Because remember, because of the French Revolution, we had been having problems with should the government remain neutral? Should the government, be closer to England, be closer to France? And remember, Washington and Adams were considered Anglophiles, and definitely Hamilton was. So the Federalists were considered to be English lovers. They loved everything English. The Democratic Republicans tended to be more Francophiles. Okay. And so that is really the difference there about why the election of 1800 is considered such a revolution is that we were changing sides not only diplomatically but politically. The political ideology of the two individuals were completely different. Adams and Jefferson were close friends, but yet didn't really get along politically. Certainly Hamilton didn't get along with Jefferson, and Jefferson even has problems within his own political party. And again, that's why they would consider it ideology, not a party, because they really had no connections. You know, Hamilton and Adams didn't get along the same way that Jefferson wasn't going to get along with his vice president. His vice president was Aaron Burr, and nobody got along with Aaron Burr. And that, again, is another issue that may come up on the exam as well. Kind of keep in mind that the election of 1800 also made us fix the Electoral College system in the fact that the Electoral College used to basically throw everybody into the hat. Everybody was voted on, and you voted for a president and a vice president. The problem is that year, the president and vice president tied. They both got the equal amount of Electoral College votes. If memory serves, it was 73 apiece. Since the Electoral College could not decide the presidential election, it was then kicked to the House of Representatives. There was legitimately a attempt by Hamilton and his compatriots to maybe even delay and make it to where Jefferson and Burr never took over the presidency. That was kind of foiled by Adams and a few others who kind of realized there needed to be a transition of power. The question was which one, Jefferson or Burr? It took days. It's not like they settled this within a couple hours. It took days. I think it was about 6 days in. They finally said, you know what, we'll let Jefferson be the president. And it was just one vote in Maryland. And it ended up being a guy that basically just turned in a blank ballot that swung and allowed Jefferson to get the one extra vote needed to be president of the United States. As dumb as that all is, Jefferson comes in. And that's the first time we have a Democratic Republican stepping into office. He immediately kind of parlays Washington and Adams' diplomacy into the biggest land grab in United States history. Because we had been getting closer and closer to the British diplomatically throughout Washington and Adams' tenure, it becomes very apparent that we can then possibly scare France into being friendlier with us. And at that point, it was Napoleon. Now, you weren't going to scare Napoleon into anything, but Napoleon was hard up for cash. So sure enough, that's the famous instance where James Monroe, who at that point was over in France as a representative of the United States government as a diplomat, is offered a huge chunk of land in Louisiana for $15 million. $15 million we don't have. $15 million Congress has not okayed. $15 million that Jefferson has not asked for. So his major accomplishment, again, is the Louisiana Purchase. He literally doubles the size of the United States. But as we talked about in class, and as a refresher, that was very, very controversial and certainly extra constitutional. It was quite honestly unconstitutional what he did. But they let it go because it was such a good deal. This just proves right now that if you're going to violate the Constitution, you better do it in a very creative and beneficial way to the United States, because then they kind of forgive you. Jefferson basically does manage to get Louisiana, but he has issues right after that. If you remember, in 1807, he's going to get us involved in an embargo. He's going to get us involved where basically at that point, Napoleon is trying to conquer the world. England's getting involved, Russia's involved, everybody in the European mainland is involved, and the United States is trying to stay out of it. Jefferson wants no part of it, and so he basically comes up with the idea that we are not going to trade with any nation at war. While this is not crippling to the Southern economy, it is devastating to the New England economy. The mercantile or the merchants, if you will, up in New York, in Boston, in Philadelphia, they are hurt by this. So the embargo is not exactly a popular thing, and it doesn't help that Jefferson is a Southern gentleman plantation farmer. So not surprisingly, the embargo is very, very negative. That being said, Jefferson still coasts through his second term, and he manages to get his protege, James Madison, as his follower, as his successor. Madison steps into office predominantly because he had been very, very adept as a congressman. He was, of course, a writer of the Federalist Papers along with Hamilton and Jay. He was the architect of the Constitution, and it also helps that he had been Secretary of State and had negotiated a number of different deals, including the Louisiana Purchase as well. He had a hand in that, being the Secretary of State. Madison steps in and pretty much gets us involved in a war that ends up becoming called Mr. Madison's War. It was not a very popular war. The War of 1812 starts really on the western frontier because the British had basically been kind of messing around with us out there, even with Jay's Treaty back in 1794, telling the British they had to kind of relinquish their land rights. They never followed through. They were impressing our sailors. They were violating our treaties. And so the United States felt like they had no choice but to go to war. Now, again, this became a very sectional conflict. Western frontiersmen definitely wanted a war because the British were supplying all kinds of money and resources and guns and whatever else to Native American tribes. This is when Tecumseh starts to come and be a force to be reckoned with around Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky. So not surprisingly, this becomes an issue. And then, of course, Southerners also want this because they want the British to basically kind of leave them alone, and they want better trade deals, and they're war hawks at that point is what they're known. They just want to go to war. The area or region of the United States that didn't want to go was New England. New England didn't want any part of the war because they knew it would be even more economically crippling than the embargo. So this ends up being the death knell of the Federalist Party. These New England businessmen hatch a scheme up in Hartford where they basically say they are going to try and remove themselves from the United States. They're going to secede from the Union and kind of seek their own peace agreement with Great Britain. Now, nothing ever comes of it, but once the Hartford Convention starts to be leaked out, people start finding out about this meeting and what they were saying, the Federalists are done. This is the end of the Federalist Party during the War of 1812. Now, of course, the Democratic Republicans almost lost the war because keep in mind the War of 1812, the highlight for the United States was the Battle of New Orleans, and that was fought after the peace agreement in 1815. But the highlight for the British is that they captured our capital city and burned it to the ground. They burned down the White House. They burned down the Capitol building. They burned down about 90% of Washington, D.C. And then they attacked Baltimore, which managed to hang on through the dawn's early light at Fort McHenry, and the British attack basically sputtered after that. But it didn't go well. It's not like we have this laundry list of heroes from the War of 1812. So one name that kind of emerges from the War of 1812 as a household name is Andrew Jackson, because he's the leader that wins the Battle of New Orleans. And even though it's after the peace agreement, we didn't know, of course, because of transatlantic travel being as slow as it was. When they attacked New Orleans, they would have had no idea that the Treaty of Ghent was already signed. Okay, but the War of 1812, very, very negative and somewhat sectionalized our country. Now, of course, Madison leaves office in 1817 for James Monroe. Monroe, another Virginia gentleman, steps into office, and he is considered to be the president during the era of good feeling. The reason the Federalist Party is dead, the Democratic Republicans are the only ones left. And so there's this general feeling out there that since there's not two political ideologies really floating out there, that we're all just going to get along. You and I both know that's not the case. There are going to be issues. And of course, one of the main issues is going to be the sectionalization as we start to expand west. Should these new territories be slave or free? The Northerners said, you know what, we came up with the Northwest Territory, the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, that said new territories that are transitioning to statehood will not have slavery. And the Southern states said, that's just for that region. It's not for the other regions as well. And they're going to make the argument that Kentucky, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, those are going to be added as states from territory status that already had slaves. So their argument is if slaves are a part of the territory's history, that they would then, of course, have the right to be a slave state. This all culminates in 1820 when Missouri applies to be a slave state. They basically say, we want to enter the Union as a slave state. A lot of people cry foul because it's going to throw off the sectional balance of North versus South and slave versus free. So, of course, in rides Henry Clay, the great compromiser. He comes up with the Compromise of 1820, better known as the Missouri Compromise, where Missouri comes in as a slave state and Maine separates from Massachusetts finally and becomes another state that is free. And it manages to balance that out. And then, of course, they draw that famous line from the southern border of Missouri all the way out to the Pacific Ocean, which, of course, at the time means that there's going to be way more northern states than there will be southern states. If you remember, the Louisiana Purchase kind of goes in a V shape up the Mississippi River and then out through the Missouri River out towards what is today Oregon. When that happens, there are a number of Southerners that are saying, hey, wait, we're going to get hemmed in. But then there are other Southerners saying, yeah, but Texas and this other Mexican territory, we're going to eventually be able to take it. So the seeds are planted for the inevitability of a Mexican war down the line. Monroe also, of course, has a very active cabinet. The most active on the cabinet was John Quincy Adams, who negotiated, as we talked about in class, numerous trade deals and diplomatic gains that I don't think any other Secretary of State was ever really quite as accomplished as John Quincy Adams. He manages, of course, to get Florida in the Adams-Otis Treaty in 1819. And of course, he basically makes it to where Oregon's going to be either ours or the British by eliminating all other competitors up until that point. And of course, when Jackson leads troops down into Florida to go after the Seminole tribe, John Quincy Adams is the only one on the cabinet that says, well, wait a minute, let's not condemn this guy right away. He's got a good idea going on, which eventually allows him to get such a favorable treaty with the Spanish to gain Florida. So again, these guys are kind of the next generation of the founders, if you will, and they're really kind of dictating the fact that the American diplomacy and politics are going to change dramatically with their leadership. Now, of course, as much as John Quincy Adams is a very, very accomplished diplomat and Secretary of State, he's really kind of a lousy president. Now, part of that is he's like his dad. He's way too much like his dad. He's short-tempered. He's kind of cranky. He doesn't quite get along with people, and he always thinks he's the smartest man in the room. We've all kind of known somebody before that just, they're always the smartest guy, but it doesn't mean they're very nice. They can be very condescending. At the same time as well, to be fair to him, he's not really fitting in with the political ideology of the time. And he doesn't realize that the politics are changing, that the Democratic Republicans aren't really just one ideology. They're a multitude of ideologies. And he really doesn't want to deviate from what he believes are American principles. The person that does want to deviate is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson, of course, feels that he won in 1824, and by all intents and purposes, he did. But John Quincy Adams had taken it because of a technicality in the House of Representatives. Jackson ends up winning outright in 1828, becomes the 7th president after John Quincy Adams only serves that one term, just like his daddy. And Jackson immediately sets loose on one of the most active presidencies of the early republic. As much as Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe seemed to have a lot of things happen, it always seemed to happen where they were just kind of sitting back and it was falling in their laps. Madison didn't provoke the War of 1812. Jefferson didn't seek out the Louisiana Purchase. Monroe didn't even write his own doctrine in 1823. John Quincy Adams wrote it. So these guys kind of almost sat back and let things happen. Jackson's not like that. Jackson's going to go after things. He's the one that's going to pursue the Trail of Tears, even when the Supreme Court says it's illegal. He's the one that's going to basically axe the bank, the Second National Bank of the United States, and not renew its charter, even when the Supreme Court said it was constitutional. If he basically uses the veto as a weapon, no other president had used it like that. Jackson did. Jackson truly believed that if he thought something wasn't right, if he just didn't like something, he would veto it. Okay. And then, of course, his tariff issue, when John C. Calhoun raises questions about whether or not the tariff of abominations is the right way to go, Jackson doesn't take too kindly to people going against his wishes and his policies. So when Calhoun basically says, well, we're going to nullify it, we're not going to follow it, that's when Jackson wants to hitch up the horses and go down and hang his own vice president. He's talked out of it. But still, because Jackson is so divisive as a president and as a human being, quite honestly, that's also the birth of the other political party. Whereas Jackson and Van Buren are going to foster the development of the Democratic Party, the opposition to Jackson and his policies are going to foster the development of the Whigs. Okay. And there's where you really get your very first political parties during the 1830s. Okay. And that's really where the modern political party is born, is from Jackson and the anti-Jacksonians who form the Whigs. Now, of course, after Jackson, Van Buren is his chosen successor. And as with most instances where you have a dynamic president, the person who follows up probably isn't going to do as well. Van Buren, unfortunately, has all the fallout of Jackson's term. He has the political fallout of, how Jackson ran the office, but he also has the economic fallout when the bank fails and we have a panic of 1837. Van Buren really has no way of combating it. So, of course, the panic pretty much ruins any chance of Van Buren ever continuing as president. And Van Buren is just indecisive. He was very similar to Monroe. I'll just sit back. I'll let my advisors tell me what to do. I'll take every event as they come in. That was no longer how the presidency was looked upon because Jackson had changed it. Not completely, but he had changed quite a bit of it. So he loses re-election to William Henry Harrison, who promptly drops dead. Which paves the way for John Tyler. John Tyler, of course, has a very uneventful time in office because mostly everybody hates him. The Democrats don't like him, and the Whigs don't trust him. Even though he is a Whig, he's a Whig in name only. Okay, so because of that, they don't trust him. They don't really believe that he's going to be president anyway over the time, after the next presidential election. So he's just kind of a sitting duck. A lame duck, as it's known in political terms, for the entire 3.5 years he's sitting in the Oval Office. Now, John Tyler does manage to kind of lob a little shell towards the incoming president because when Polk wins and is walking into the office, he has to deal with the Texas issue because Texas had been fighting for their independence back in the 1830s. So roughly when Jackson and Van Buren were sitting in the Oval Office, they had kind of kept their hands off it. They didn't want to look like they were warmongers, and they didn't want to upset the Mexican government. So they had kind of let things go with Texas. Tyler just says, you know what, we're going to annex it. And annex, of course, means to add on. He adds Texas to the United States, which is the very first threat, if you will, to the Mexican government or offense to the Mexican government that's going to precipitate the Mexican War.
Didn't he do that on like his last day in office?
Yeah. It was kind of his parting gift, if you will. So Tyler, not to be outdone, not to, I always think Tyler's kind of an interesting character. He was not somebody that wanted the presidency per se, but when he got it, he thought he could do a lot of great things. He just didn't realize that nobody was on board with it. The one thing he kind of gave us, and I'll give him credit, is he managed to say, when Harrison died, well, then I'm president. And he took the oath of office and he became the president. There's really nothing in the Constitution that says that's how it works. Tyler just did it, so we just kind of said okay and went along with it.
Well, I mean, it makes sense. Second in command takes over for first in command. Makes the most sense.
Keep in mind, though, and look, Tyler was taking it from the standpoint that Adams always wrote when he was vice president that was his job. Adams always kind of wrote that if Washington, he always used to say, I'm a heartbeat away from the presidency. So Tyler kind of took it from, well, if it was good enough for Adams, it's good enough for the rest of us too. And even though the Constitution doesn't expressly say it, since Adams said it and nobody said otherwise, that's the way it's going to be. That's the way it's going to be done. But keep in mind, what was the office that usually was the springboard to the presidency back then? It wasn't the vice president.
It was Secretary
of State. Okay, and so it's not a surprise. In case you don't realize, the Secretary of State at the time was Daniel Webster. Okay, he was part of the Great Triumvirate. Everybody kind of thought, well, wouldn't Daniel Webster be a better choice for the presidency? He's a career politician. He's somebody who's been Secretary of State. He's been a senator. He's arguably the best speaker of the time period. You know, he was a very accomplished orator, and the guy had negotiated treaties. So everybody kind of said, well, why wouldn't that guy be president of the United States? Tyler just jumps in, and everybody kind of views it as, well, he just jumped in line. You know, he helped Harrison get elected, and then when Harrison died, he just kind of jumped in and took over. All that being said, though, he did it anyway. And when everybody kind of treats him poorly for the 3.5 or so years, his parting blow is to say, all right, here's Texas, good luck. And he walks out.
That was big.
Yeah, well, most people would have shied away from it. Most people would have said, oh, man, I can't believe he did that to me. Polk took it as an opportunity. So when Mexico complains, Polk basically says tough. And he sends an army down under the command of Zachary Taylor to enforce the border. Now, of course, there are questions as to whether or not he enforced the right border. And there really isn't any question. There's plenty of, we talked about in class about Spotty Lincoln, that Lincoln questioned whether or not Taylor was on the correct side of the Nueces River. He was not. I found it interesting. I was doing one of those webinars today, and they were talking about U.S. Grant, and we read a document where U.S. Grant basically said in the document, because he was part of that expedition, he was one of the commanders under the leadership of General Taylor. He basically admits in his document, we were definitely south of the Nueces River. We definitely were on Mexican soil. So Lincoln and Grant were on the same page completely. Grant knew what they were doing was wrong. So Lincoln was not wrong with this. Lincoln was absolutely correct. And luckily for Grant and for Polk, Grant's letter was not published at the time. Had it been published, Polk would have had a lot of questions, and Grant would have been thrown out of the army and told never to come back. So again, they definitely did some pretty cloak and dagger stuff there, but they did manage to cause the war. So Polk does manage to guide us through the Mexican War. We get the Mexican Cession out of it. What we fail to realize is that's really going to be the first volley of the Civil War. Because we add that territory, now we're going to have to figure out what to do with it. And of course, Wilmot's Proviso comes out during that time period saying that any new land should be free. Since the Mexican government had outlawed slavery, and Wilmot's going along with the Northwest Territory, that, hey, that part, there were no slaves to start off with. We're not going to add to it. There's precedent there. But of course, the proviso never passes. That's all during Polk's time. Now, of course, he also settles Oregon, where they managed to finally come together with a treaty that settles the Canadian and United States border, and more importantly, make the border non-defensible, meaning we don't have massive forts and walls and machine gun nests and things all along the border trying to protect us from Canada, and Canada is not protecting themselves from us. So it's been the longest unguarded border in the world since the 1840s. Okay, so again, all that happens under Polk's presidency, and it was only one term. Polk leaves office because he knows he's going to work himself to death, and he ended up doing it because Polk dies soon afterwards. Polk, of course, gives way to Taylor. Taylor has to deal with the free soil argument out of the Wilmot Proviso. He is a slave owner himself, and so therefore he really doesn't want this to become a big issue. He would much rather quietly just kind of go about things, but it doesn't matter anyway. He ends up dying in office. He gets food poisoning and dies, paving the way for Millard Fillmore from New York. Fillmore isn't a slave owner. It panics a bunch of people immediately that, oh, he's going to be a free soiler. What they fail to realize is that Fillmore doesn't really want to do anything. He kind of just wants to sit back and let things happen. He's, again, one of those presidents that's like, look, I'll sit in the Oval Office, you bring me problems, and I'll tell you what I think. So he's not a man of action. He's certainly not a Jackson or a Polk. So he just kind of sits back and lets things happen. Now, of course, the crowning achievement during his time in office is the Compromise of 1850, negotiated by Henry Clay, but Clay is in his dying days, if you will. It's really a young senator from Illinois by the name of Stephen Douglas. Stephen A. Douglas comes in and negotiates the Compromise of 1850. It doesn't really accomplish all that much. It's a complete and total failure in the long run, mostly because it's superseded by the Kansas-Nebraska Act anyway, just 4 years later. The main thing that the Compromise of 1850 does is it settles the issue of what to do with California. California comes in as a free state, but it eliminates the Missouri Compromise line, basically, and paves the way for what becomes known as popular sovereignty, settling the issue of slavery. And as we know, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which is the act that is put into place by the next president, Franklin Pierce, who's trying to appease the South as much as possible. He's a Southern apologist, even though he's from New Hampshire. Franklin Pierce comes in, passes that, through Congress, and then signs it. And it allows for popular sovereignty, which was the brainchild and an idea of Stephen A. Douglas, that you just let the local populations of the state figure it out for themselves. Don't make the federal government say a thing, which on paper sounds like a good thing to do, but Kansas proved that that didn't work. Now, since Pierce, again, was another president that seemed to just sit back and let things happen, he is not even nominated by his party, and he's replaced by James Buchanan, who does the exact same thing. And even when he does take action, he takes the wrong action. So when Kansas ends up becoming a bleeding mess, literally bleeding Kansas in 1857, in the early stages of Buchanan's time in office, when all that is going on, Buchanan takes the decisive action of basically certifying the new state constitution. The problem is he certified the wrong one. He certified the Lecompton Constitution, which was made by a bunch of slave owners. That the Constitution basically was a love note to slave owning everywhere, instead of going along with the other Constitution, which was the legitimate one. Buchanan never went back on it, so therefore Kansas technically was a slave state. This caused even more animosity and literal violence to actually occur throughout Kansas in 1857. So Buchanan probably could have done better just sitting back and ignoring the issue than what he actually did. It doesn't help during his time that Dred Scott becomes a massive Supreme Court case, and that Roger B. Taney basically says that not only is Dred Scott not capable of suing for his freedom, he's not even a man, so therefore he can't sue at all. So it removes all humanity from African Americans in general, and definitely from the slave population of the South. This type of environment causes people like John Brown to lose their ever-loving mind and look to overthrow the government, or at least cause a slave uprising. And so John Brown's raid happens in the tail end of Buchanan's presidency. Brown is arrested. He is, of course, put to death. And it caused animosity throughout the United States and the abolitionist movement to take another level now, where they now have what is known as a martyr. They have somebody that has died for their cause that can be readily identifiable throughout the United States. It's in that environment when Buchanan is basically, thrown out of his own party. The Democrats are done with him. They nominate Stephen A. Douglas. But then the Southern Democrats say that's not our guy, even though Stephen A. Douglas said, hey, I've been the one fighting for you with popular sovereignty. It's still not good enough. The Southerners walk out of the convention and nominate their own presidential candidate in Kentucky's John C. Breckinridge. Then there's another party, another splintering of it, that say, well, we don't want all this fighting, we want unity. They form the Constitutional Union Party and nominate a guy named John Bell. Those three candidates all are going to take Democratic votes. What they fail to realize is that there is a legitimate third party that had already started from the ashes of the Free Soil and Whig parties, and even some know-nothings for that matter, too. All of those political parties had fused together to form into the Republican Party. The modern Republican Party is formed. Abraham Lincoln becomes their candidate in 1860, mostly on the grounds of his debates that he had in a Senate debate or a Senate race against Stephen A. Douglas. And so Lincoln runs. against these three candidates. The three candidates, of course, split the vote throughout most of the United States. Lincoln manages to get most of the votes in the North in the Electoral College, which is important because he's not even on the ballot in most of the Southern states. But because he gets enough votes in the northern states, he wins the Electoral College, becomes president of the United States, and South Carolina promptly secedes. This is the first step towards civil war. Lincoln tries desperately to talk them out of it, but before long, they fire on Fort Sumter and the Civil War is inaugurated. He guides us through the Civil War, tries his best to hold the Union together. It's not until 1863, in January of 1863, that he turns the Civil War into a war against slavery, a war of abolition. It's the Emancipation Proclamation that shifts the Northern effort from unity to now abolition. Now we become an army, the Northern Army becomes an army of liberation. So as Sherman goes through the South, burning towns, villages, you name it, he's also liberating slaves. And of course, this gives even more of a emphasis on the North to go down and punish the South for starting this conflict, especially over slavery. We thank Lincoln for all of his efforts by having John Wilkes Booth assassinate him. So when he dies in 1865, his vice president, a Tennessean by the name of Andrew Johnson, takes over, and he promptly starts the era of Reconstruction. Now, of course, Reconstruction is an abject failure. It's not for lack of effort. They try, but they can never quite agree on how best to rebuild the Union. Johnson, because he looks like a Southern apologist, ends up getting impeached. He is the first president ever brought up on charges. Nothing ever happens because of it. Even though he comes very close to conviction, he stays in office for the rest of his term, and he is replaced by the very first Ohioan president. I didn't realize this until today. I thought it was interesting. I had forgotten about this. Ohio in this time period, we talked about in class about how Ohio had so many presidents. I had forgotten this, like I said, until today. Ohio had so many presidents because I had forgotten in the late 1800s, we were the third largest state when it came to population. So it's no surprise that they tried to get us involved in presidential politics, because if you could secure Ohio, there was a good chance you were going to be president of the United States. We were only smaller than New York and Pennsylvania during that time period. We had a larger population than literally every other state. Now, around 1900, other states started to catch up, okay, which is why you see the last of the Ohio presidents in 1920 with the ascension of Warren G. Harding. But there's a reason why there's a string of Ohio presidents. We're a very large state. We're important. We've been steadily declining ever since. So that being said, I just thought it was interesting today. I'd totally forgotten about that. Grant becomes the first Ohio president, of course, on the heels of his triumph in the Civil War. He has the unfortunate distinction of being there when the industrial age turns into the Gilded Age. And he sees the rise of political machines. He sees the rise of corrupt business practices, trusts, monopolies, you name it. And he gets a bad rap for all of that. I think we're going to definitely see a new debate in historical circles about whether or not Grant was a failure or just misunderstood as president. But either way, Grant kind of rides that out. There's plenty of scandals around him. The one thing that he is definitely kind of guilty of is being too loyal to people, and feeling like people in his cabinet and around him in government positions are reputable, great people because he served with him during the war. What he fails to realize is, yeah, they were good soldiers, but they're actually pretty awful human beings and, do really unfortunate things. So Grant is surrounded by scandal. He doesn't actually have scandals himself. He's fine. It's just everybody around him seems to be kind of getting in on these scandals. And we know that Grant definitely didn't do anything because Grant leaves the presidency basically broke. If he was crooked, he was terrible at it. So most likely he was probably the most honest person in the government, which didn't work out well for him financially. He's replaced by another Ohioan, Rutherford B. Hayes. If you remember, Hayes comes to power in one of the most disputed elections in American history, where Samuel B. Tilden actually won more electoral college votes, but it was turned over to the House, and the House brokered a deal. The Southerners said, "Hey, we'll vote for Hayes if you end Reconstruction." So sure enough, they traded Hayes for Reconstruction ending, which basically was saying the Republicans get Hayes and the South gets to basically deny African Americans rights and institute Jim Crow laws for the next 100 years. Not a good trade. So needless to say, Hayes only serves one term. He's replaced by another Ohioan in James A. Garfield, who comes into office trying to do some civil service reform, clear out those political parties or the political machines. He promptly gets shot. Charles Guiteau ends up taking him down. Garfield dies. He's replaced by an actual political machine hack, Chester A. Arthur. All his life, he had been some little stooge for the political machine of New York. To his credit, Chester A. Arthur, when he is confronted with being president of the United States, realizes he's got to step up and do the right thing, and actually does attempt to do some civil service reform, manages to get the Pendleton Act through Congress, which does a great deal to stemming some of the influence of these political machines and certainly political parties in general. Be that as it may, he's not renominated. Grover Cleveland ends up winning anyway, shifting away from the Republicans for the first time in a very long time. Democrats had not had a president since Buchanan. So Cleveland comes in. He becomes president. He's another New Yorker. And again, New York, Pennsylvania, and Ohio, the top three states. The state that really gets screwed during this time period is Pennsylvania. They don't have a president, but Cleveland does come in, tries to go against the political machines, and becomes immediately blasted by the media, which is, of course, owned by the political machines. He is blasted by corporate trusts, which, of course, he's not capable of going up against because he really doesn't have anything in the arsenal to really take care of that. But he does manage to get the Sherman Antitrust Act passed. Nobody enforces it, but it's passed. Whatever. He ends up losing re-election. Benjamin Harrison takes over, another Ohioan. He takes over, tries to do kind of some of those same reforms, loses credit, faith, and whatever else, and loses re-election to Cleveland. Cleveland then, of course, tries civil service reforms, and then he is replaced even on the Democratic nomination by William Jennings Bryan. But as you remember, he is a three-time loser. He never became president of the United States. He loses to William McKinley, another Ohio president, who then transitions us away from the Gilded Age. He's kind of on the limit of gilded towards progressive. If you remember, the populists had been around during that time period, kind of changing political theory, changing the direction of politics in general, and turning us towards reform. He is also the first president to usher us into imperialism, as he is the president during the Spanish-American War. So there's all your presidents from the Gilded Age. Remember that image of this is on your Google Classroom page. The thing I didn't talk about were all the reform movements and social movements during the 1800s. Just to give you a background, there is a key distinct difference between the early 1800s, the mid 1800s, and the late 1800s. So the three different units. In the early Republic, the main push and the main kind of social movements, Horace Mann pushing for public school education. That's a major one. Okay. Trying to standardize what is being taught to make sure that anybody that's going to school is getting the resources they need, getting the funding they need, getting a school teacher that is actually certified to teach. All of that is in its early stages in the early 1800s. Dorothea Dix pushing for prison reform and mental health reform, not to mention just healthcare in general being reformed. Okay, now that's not really going to get accomplished till the Civil War, when you have Dorothea Dix working as a medical nurse during the Civil War, but really Clara Barton being the push towards what eventually becomes the Red Cross. Okay, so that really didn't see the end result until the Civil War time, but it starts in the early 1800s. Of course, in the early 1800s, you also have the abolitionist movement, which is on the heels of a number of things. In 1808, the international slave trade goes away per the Constitution. That's not to say that there aren't hiccups along the way. The Amistad situation in the 1830s certainly is going to prove that we haven't really shut down the international slave trade because there's still smuggling. Okay, but it's certainly going to grow into the abolitionist movement during that time period, because while they thought shutting down international slave trade was going to slowly strangle the slavery question, if you will, and just kind of let it, kind of die off over the time, because of King Cotton, slavery continued to grow. So a lot of Northerners said, hey, we made a deal that slavery would slowly peter out. It's actually growing. So the abolitionist movement, spurred on by people like William Lloyd Garrison, Frederick Douglass, Phyllis Wheatley, you name it, all of these people who push for the abolitionist movement really start during the 1830s and 40s. So in the early stages of the 1800s, those are pretty much your social movements that have a tremendous amount of traction and push to change things. In the mid 1800s, that's really where you start seeing the women's rights movement. Of course, the women's rights movement, the key event is the Seneca Falls Convention, which happened in 1848. They draw up the Declaration of Sentiments, and that's really the first time you see the women's suffragette movement start. Is the women's rights movement specifically for voting is going to happen in the mid 1800s. Okay, it's not to say there isn't a women's rights movement before that, but they really don't gain traction until the mid 1800s. Now, of course, they are overshadowed throughout the 1850s because of the growing tide towards the Civil War, and everything is. Okay, the only thing that really gains traction during the 1850s, other than sectional strife and what becomes known as sectionalization prior to the Civil War, the only thing that really kind of shares in that is abolition. That's really the only thing, because you see it continue on with Harriet Beecher Stowe and writing Uncle Tom's Cabin. You see John Brown. You see all of these, the Dred Scott decision, amongst many others. You're going to see the abolitionist movement grow to a crescendo during the 1850s. The late 1800s social movement are completely different. Labor unions, because of industrialization growing, you're going to see the labor unions grow and prosper during that time period. Now, of course, they're going to have their hiccups, as we talked about in a DBQ session. They're still going to have their issues. And of course, they learn that they cannot turn violent and they cannot show any sort of aggression. If they do, they lose public support. And once they do that, they lose whatever they were fighting for. So the labor unions are not only going to form in the late 1800s to combat the problems in the factories and the manufacturing in general, they're going to actually grow and prosper and learn from their mistakes to where in the early 1900s, they become a political force to be reckoned with. Okay, so the labor movement, certainly in the late 1800s, civil rights starts to gain traction. You're talking about W.E.B. Du Bois and Booker T. Washington being the major leaders of the civil rights movement against Jim Crow laws and against the failure of the United States government and state governments in general to enforce the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment. Obviously, the 13th Amendment was enforced. The abolition of slavery still was, that happened. But the 14th Amendment that guaranteed citizenship rights, the 15th Amendment that guaranteed voting rights to African Americans was not being enforced, certainly in Jim Crow states. So that was all kind of happening in the late 1800s as well. Other pushes in the late 1800s, very much an anti-immigrant tenor during that time period. You had the Chinese Exclusion Act that happened in the late 1800s. You had immigration acts that put quotas on certain areas, saying, we have too many Italians, and that was very much a nativist sentiment during that time period, that they didn't want Roman Catholics. They didn't want poor people. They didn't want people with weird political ideologies coming into the country. It certainly wasn't about, they would say on the surface it was about jobs, or it was about, hey, they're, driving the wages down. In reality, They were nervous about the outside influences of these people. And a lot of times it was just straight up racism or prejudicial belief structures. And of course, the Irish get punished time and time again during that time period as well for just stuff that's outside of their control. And that doesn't really come to a head in the until the early 1900s. But it's the only reason it doesn't come to that kind of culmination is because the progressives are actually going to fight against that. The sad thing is, in the late 1800s, nobody was fighting against that. And if they were, they weren't gaining any traction. So social movements can also be negative. There was a very much anti-immigration bent towards the late 1800s because of all the immigrants coming in. That's not to say there weren't people trying to help them. Ellis Island formed specifically to be the government way station to at least have a paper trail of these people coming in. But there are questions as to whether or not that was really helpful. Especially to the immigrants themselves, because it literally was, they drop them off in New York and say, well, here's New York, welcome to America, good luck. And if they didn't speak English, or if they didn't know where to go, if they didn't have family here, if they didn't have friends here, what do they do? Where do they find a place to live? And there were certainly people that were crooked, that were, trying to harass them or take things from them. So needless to say, there's plenty of kind of social movements during that time period to make cities better. There were certain social movements to make Americans better as people. But again, it was the Gilded Age. There was a lot of corruption. There was a lot of issues. And so, social movements during that time period weren't really as strong.
Didn't the Hull House come around?
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Didn't the Hull House come around to help immigrants?
That came later. That was part of the progressive movement fighting against that anti-immigrant.
So that was early 19 rather than late 18.
Jane Addams would have been around early 1900s, 1900 really.
All right.
So during the progressive movement.
All right.
And when you think Jane Addams, pair her up with the muckraking journalists, pair her up with Roosevelt, Taft, and Wilson, because the progressive presidents, Adams is going to be right there with them. All right. What questions do we have about the 1800s? All right. So my tip for you is to go over the 1800s as much as you can. In talking with Dowling today, he and I are totally on the same page. The question you get is most likely, we're 99.9% sure, the question you're going to get is going to be something from the 1800s. Now, of course, we've been wrong before, and we're taking our best guess. But judging from our kind of talks here, I think the only other time period that the question might come out of is the Progressive Era. But the Progressive Era was the subject of a DBQ just a few years ago. So we're thinking that it's probably the 1800s. Even if it is the Progressive Era, knowing the unit on the Gilded Age is going to help you to answer the question on the Progressive Era anyway. So do yourself a favor. If you're going to go over some things over the next couple of days, it should be what we just talked about today. Okay. Again, as you're taking this exam, you can have things in front of you. I would try and shorten your notes to the point where you're not having to leaf through pages and pages of documents. The smart thing to do at this point is to make a very rudimentary timeline that helps you to remember when certain eras are, when certain presidents were. If you're really struggling to keep these things straight, that's the smart thing to do. And your timeline can basically go from 1600 up until 1945. Okay, so you're going from colonial America up until the time period of FDR. And you can even break it into units like I did here, where here's a timeline of presidents through 3 different units, just to keep it simple. That way you just have a little like, all right, well, who the heck followed up Polk? Taylor, Fillmore, Pierce, Buchanan. Oh, crappy presidents. Okay, so that's how I would do it, is I would just kind of have a timeline, if you will, to help you out. And again, we will have our third session tomorrow night at 9 o'clock where we talk about the early 19th. Other than that, I'm going to stop recording.